Tonight, the death of Pol Pot, what it means in terms of history, perspective, and review. Dr. Henry Kissinger.
But it's not going to be a model democracy, and the suffering that these people have undergone must have produced a rift in that society and in the souls of people that will take a long time to heal.
And the death of Pol Pot will not cure that either.
No.
And the incredible trumpet player, Wynton Marsalis, and his new album.
The feeling that you get from playing and getting things out, the ideas come to you and you get to put them down. And also when you work, you stay prepared for things when they come to you. And that's really it's like you're always ready.
We conclude with the scientist from Harvard who's won 2 Pulitzer Prizes for his writing, E.O. Wilson.
Many people think that scientists proceed by some kind of ironclad literal system of logic, looking at masses of data and then deciding that there's some kind of relationship or law there that they must puzzle out, like working a Sunday crossword puzzle. That isn't the way science works at all. The greatest scientists, Einstein's example, Newton and others, take great leaps of the imagination.
Kissinger, Marsalis, and Wilson when we continue.
Charlie Rose is made possible by USA Networks as part of our continuing commitment to innovative television. Through USA Network and the Sci-Fi Channel, we provide original entertainment to America and the world.
Anywhere, anytime, any book. BarnesandNoble.com, where the world shops for books.
Cisco Systems, the company that brought the Internet to business, is pleased to help bring The Charlie Rose Show to PBS. Cisco Systems, empowering the Internet generation.
Charlie Rose is also made possible by these funders.
And by Bloomberg, a provider of multimedia news and information services worldwide. From our studios in New York City, this is Charlie Rose.
Khmer Rouge officials announced that Pol Pot, the architect of Cambodia's killing fields, died last night. It is still unclear whether his death was a result of a heart attack, as was reported, or from natural causes. Pol Pot was believed responsible for the deaths of nearly 2 million Cambodians during his reign of terror in the 1970s. After a coup last year removed him from power, the Khmer Rouge leadership indicated that they were willing to turn him over to international authorities last week. Joining me now for a conversation about the life of this leader, now dead, and also Cambodia, former Secretary of State, Dr. Henry Kissinger. Welcome.
Good to be here. Thank you.
Put this guy in perspective in terms of history, the context of evil, the context of what he meant in the flow of history.
Well, Pol Pot and his group was a weird combination of sort of French rationalism and communist ideology. One of his colleagues, Guillaume Sampan, I think his name was, wrote a PhD thesis in France in the 50s, in which he said that if communists ever took power in Cambodia, they should exterminate all the people with education, all the vestiges of the bourgeois culture. And he accused of Mao and Stalin of having been too soft because they left kernels of the old society. So this was the group that took over there in 1975 at the end of the Cambodian Civil War, in which, I must say, to our shame, the American Congress cut off support to the government that was...
The government of Lon Nol.
The government of Lon Nol. Well, he had left by then, but anyway, the government of Cambodia. Nobody, in fairness to those people who did this, nobody could imagine what would happen. Because there were many people who argued at the time that ending the war was preferable to anything that might happen as a result. As soon as the Khmer Rouge came into Phnom Penh, they emptied the city. Everybody had to leave the city, including patients in hospitals, and they were sent out into the countryside and into the jungles, where there was absolutely no means of supporting them. So certainly tens of thousands, maybe hundreds of thousands died in that first evacuation. Then they killed, together with their families, every member of the previous administration, everybody who had any education at all, and anybody else that they thought might conceivably have elements of what they called bourgeois culture. They took children from their parents and put the parents into barracks. They wanted to break up family ties. And they killed those 2 million people, which was over a third of the population, or nearly a third of the population, in 2 years. And they did it manually. They didn't have extermination. I mean, they beat them to death. Most of the time, they beat them to death.
And the world stood by.
And
the world stood by.
Well, the world stood by. Again, those of us who were in the government at the time didn't want to stand by originally. Then, when the killing began, we tried to tell newspapers what we picked up from their radio instructions to their subordinates. And I don't blame the journalists. They couldn't believe it. And they thought this was just another gimmick to keep it going. And by the time that everybody knew, it was fairly well along, but still it was unforgivable. The world should have intervened.
Was it did this government, the government that you served, other Western governments bear some responsibility for Pol Pot coming to power and having the opportunity?
Well, you know, this is the year of apologies.
Yes.
And of self-flagellation. It's a curious, and a lot of people, it was an argument that was made at the time by people who were looking for alibis. The fact is, what is said is that the bombing radicalized them. We were bombing Vietnamese on Cambodian territory who were killing Americans at the rate of 500 a week. And we were bombing Khmer Rouge who were killing Cambodians. And it takes a really circuitous reasoning to say that those who try to resist the Khmer Rouge taking over are responsible for the Khmer Rouge taking over. That's like saying the people who bombed Hitler are responsible for the genocide.
Looking back, as you wrote your memoirs, would you have done what differently?
In Cambodia? Mm-hmm. Look, the administration I served took over at a time when there were already 550,000 Americans in Indochina. And we wanted to extricate them. And in retrospect, it's always easy to say this or that could have been done differently. Probably what I would say in retrospect is if we had done the things we did over 3 years all at once, it might have been more effective. But we had riots in this country. One forgets we had demonstrations. We had no choice, in my view, except a total collapse in Vietnam, or to try to get out gradually. And for that, it was essential that the killing of the Americans in South Vietnam stop. We were taking out, at the rate of 150,000 Americans a year. And so, anyway, this was the reasoning that got us involved. But I really think it's important for Americans. Not everything in the world is America's fault. And when you have a bunch of killers who killed 2 million of their own population, it really, did America try to resist? It takes a real stretch of the imagination to say that this is somehow America's fault.
Once the Vietnamese came in and did what they did and, in a sense, kicked the Khmer Rouge out, should there have been, we're looking at history with 20/20 hindsight, should there have been an effort to somehow bring him to justice for the blood of 2 million people?
What happened when the Vietnamese came in, I think it was 2 years or 3 years after the collapse, in 78, I think the Vietnamese came in. And the people they put into power in Phnom Penh were associates of Pol Pot. They had broken with Pol Pot on the issue of relationships with Vietnam.
Right.
So
and therefore they had the support.
That's right. They weren't much better than Pol Pot was. And in those days, the Khmer Rouge were still a fairly strong fighting force. But it would certainly have been, it would have behooved humanity to take a stronger position towards the killing going on in Cambodia.
That's true. But I'm now looking after that. After he is thrown out of power.
Well, he was thrown out of power, but then he went into the mountains and into the jungle and still led a fairly effective resistance. And then actually some countries, the Chinese in particular, supported Pol Pot as a counterweight to the Vietnamese supported people. And we at least tolerated it.
And that's my question to you.
I don't approve
did power
of that.
politics take over? Right.
I normally support power politics,
right.
But there is a limit. I mean, when you have the genocide like Hitler,
right,
and a genocide like Pol Pot, then there the moral outrage has to predominate over any considerations of power politics.
And this is clearly where whatever interest we had with whatever government, somebody should have.
I would not have dealt with Pol Pot for any purpose whatsoever. Power politics or anything else.
He could not have survived without some kind of cover, some kind of support from somebody, could he?
Well, he got some support from... The problem was this, that the Thais and the Chinese did not want the Vietnamese dominated Indochina.
Right.
We didn't want the Vietnamese to dominate. So I don't believe we did anything for Pol Pot. But I suspect we closed our eyes when some others did something for Pol Pot in other, not the administration which I served, but...
we closed our eyes when
because we
Thailand, because we had an interest with Thailand, so we closed our eyes to what they're doing and allowing him some kind of safe cover.
Well, some access to military supplies.
Exactly.
I think he stayed on the Cambodian side of the border, but there were refugee camps. I visited the refugee camps in Thailand once because I felt terrible about what had happened in Cambodia. And it was a terrible thing to see. But there was one area of refugee camps adjoining the Pol Pot area, which were really taken over by the Khmer Rouge, and no American was permitted in there.
So you had no access to that place?
No. And the Thais did not try to have access to that place.
They just said you can't go there.
Yeah, they probably had access, but they didn't let me go there.
Do you think he was killed, or you think he died of natural causes?
I think my first instinct when I heard it was that it was so convenient for the leadership. They had been defeated. Many of them had joined the government. Obviously, some discussions were going on, and obviously Pol Pot was supposed to be offered up as a prize, either to the international community or to the government in Phnom Penh. And it was probably too embarrassing to imagine what he might say if he were turned over. So my first instinct was that if he died of natural causes, he picked a very convenient moment for his colleagues. But killing one more person is no moral obstacle to them.
Yeah. So, but who would have done it?
I would think
who had the motive to do it?
His colleagues in the Khmer Rouge.
In the Khmer Rouge. But they're on the run now, aren't they?
Yeah, but his unit, I mean, he was allegedly kept under house arrest by the successors. And all of that is very murky because you didn't really know whether that was true. He had been so discredited that the Khmer Rouge were trying to get still some international support and also trying to get some access to the government. So I'm not even sure that he was ever really deposed. But whatever ending he had was too kind. He was one of the cruelest men
that was my original question, put him in the context. He clearly is one of the cruelest leaders ever.
Ever. I mean, the idea that you take over your country, and we were worried what would happen when the communists took over, but not in our wildest imagination did it ever occur to us that they would just empty out the cities.
Well, nothing happened in Vietnam like happening at Motor.
No, what Vietnamese did was no joyride. They had concentration camps and they put hundreds of thousands in there, but there wasn't any mass killing, and it wasn't done by whole categories and exterminating all the families.
Someone said today that it was the last gasp of sort of his failure in Cambodia. Beyond the tragedy of the loss, also marked the last gasp of sort of a violent communist revolution.
That's probably true. It was, I don't think it could happen that way today because nobody believes in communism to that extent. The Khmer Rouge leadership seems to have believed that Stalin and Mao were too soft and that they had left the vestiges of a bourgeois counter-revolution alive.
That could rise up against him or whatever.
Yeah, it actually turned out to be right.
They didn't do enough if they were trying to protect themselves.
If preserving communism at all costs was the objective. And so they decided they were going to re-educate a whole people. So anybody who ever had any education had to be killed. And then their families had to be killed because they might want to avenge their parents. And they wanted to start they wanted to get control of the education of children from day one. They separated them from their families. People had to live in barracks, work in the field.
To the end, he evidently never expressed any remorse, basically said he made tactical mistakes.
Yeah. And it was the system. I mean, there was no mistake. It isn't that somebody got killed by mistake. They had clear-cut categories. I mean, when it happened first, we received radio instructions that they sent to their cadres in the field. And so where they ordered them to kill categories of people, even we couldn't believe it.
Okay, take me down this what if. If, in fact, you had said this is unacceptable, was it feasible to do, within the context of all the other things that were on the plate at the time, to say, this is unacceptable to humanity, we're going to stop it?
Look, I'll tell you what would have happened. First of all, people would have denied that it was true. You have to remember, and luckily you don't remember probably, but this country was so divided that the peace movement would without any question have said that this is an invention by a warlike, bloodthirsty administration that has now found another excuse to re-enter the Indochina conflict from which they've just withdrawn or been forced to withdraw. And the Congress had, after all, you have to remember the Congress had cut off military aid to Cambodia. And they fought on for 4 months until literally the ammunition ran out. So if we had gone to the Congress and said, the thing you cut off, we are now going to want to reinstitute, was absolutely out of the question. We would have been run out of the country. And it really should teach us we cannot afford to conduct foreign policy when our country is so divided. We mustn't let that happen again.
You can't conduct foreign policy when the country is divided that way.
Well, at that point, really every element of civility had disappeared in the political dialogue.
There is no good roadmap that tells us. There's no great prescription that tells us what to do when we know there are huge crimes against humanity.
Well,
whether it's Bosnia or Rwanda.
Take Rwanda now.
Right.
At least in Bosnia we did something, maybe too late, but in Rwanda...
In the end, the war stopped.
Yeah, but in Rwanda, hundreds of thousands were killed. Now, it is not a country of strategic importance for the United States. You cannot define a national interest that would take us there. And yet, there I tend to think, I personally would have supported an intervention.
In Rwanda?
I would have supported it.
Even though somebody would have come to you and said, Kissinger, you have always said don't go where we have no national interest.
It would have been a violation of what ordinarily is my principle. Ordinarily, I feel you should not risk American lives for objectives where you cannot explain to the mothers why you did it.
Yeah, that's my point. Do you think today, let's assume, I mean, it's hard to put ourselves back to where Cambodia is because, as you say, of the politics and of the fissure in the society at that time, and may very well be that no one could have developed an argument to be compelling enough to get the country to be behind it. But I don't know that there is the will in American public, in the public, for America to act.
And incidentally, I don't blame
you?
I don't blame President Clinton for not doing it in Rwanda. Because it's one thing for me to sit here and say it.
Right.
But if I had sat in the White House and somebody had said, well, you've got to send these units and this and this and this, would I then have done it? My instinct tells me we should have done it in Rwanda. But then there are lots of killings. Where do you draw the line?
Exactly.
We cannot intervene against every unjust killing somewhere in the world.
So that's my point. There's no prescription. There's no roadmap to give you any sense where you can say, this passes the test and this doesn't, and this we can ask Americans to risk their lives for somebody.
No, and it's also true that if a major country did it to its own people, and you could do it only by a major war, you'd probably have to say no.
And if it was the Russians back at the height of the Cold War, we'd have had to say there's nothing we can do. They got too many nuclear weapons.
And we didn't do it when the Russians were pretty brutal in Chechnya after the Cold War.
In Chechnya?
In Chechnya.
Yeah.
And I'm not saying this critically, it's a fact of life.
And so, sometimes you run head on into whatever the power dynamic is. You might very well say, for example, you may very well say, I mean, this goes back on a different level in terms of what you can do to influence the conduct of another nation and whether you're willing to exert your power if they have a lot of power and can retaliate.
We cannot right every injustice in the world, but we should have a sense when something gets beyond a certain point that we ought to do something.
And for you, Rwanda was that, and for you, Bosnia was that, and for you, in retrospect, Cambodia was that.
No, in Cambodia...
In terms of the extremity of the act, not in terms of whether we could have done it.
In Bosnia, when there was a chance, I did try to resist. And we were stopped by the inability to get Congress to support it.
And the Western Europeans, too.
And nobody else. And we didn't know, but when we resisted, we were opposed to the communists taking over. Never occurred to us that anyone would empty the city of Phnom Penh. And if you read the newspaper reports at the time of people who were critical of us for resisting, they were saying nothing could be worse than this war. And these Khmer Rouge, they are sort of agrarian reformers who will want to... so that was the general perception of our critics. We had a harsher one, but not... We never imagined anything like this.
But Sidney Schanberg and others were winning Pulitzer Prizes for their reports.
No, not Sidney Schanberg. If you read his reports of what he predicted and compare it to what happened, he had a very, very optimistic view about the Khmer Rouge.
What's going to happen to Cambodia now? My last question.
Well, first of all, the man who's governing Cambodia now is himself of the Pol Pot group. This was a tactical fight with Pol Pot. Secondly,
he kicked out the other guy.
He was supposed to be the co-prime minister with Sihanouk's son, and he kicked out Sihanouk's son and killed several hundred of Sihanouk's supporters. So the methods, maybe not on the same scale, are not so foreign to him. Most people think now there is a fairly that he can govern, and probably the civil war will end. but it's not going to be a model democracy, and the suffering that these people have undergone must have produced a rift in that society and in the souls of people that will take a long time to heal.
And the death of Pol Pot will not cure that either.
No.
Thank you very much.
Thank you for
Pleasure
having me.
here.
Thank you.
We'll be back. Stay with us.